On my way back from the gardens in the morning, I would always stop in the bakery because it served cheap coffee. The woman who worked there, Effie, whose act of kindness had sparked my affection for the neighborhood, always admitted that she was really tired from opening the shop before dawn and from delivering newspapers by bicycle on Sundays for her sister's shop, but she never failed to ask me how I was. The only thing that would distract her would be the approach of anyone under 4 years old. And then she would lean over the counter and say, "Who is this come into my shop?" And the guy that she'd been worried would forget to eat used to parade around all day. And if ever he had an ice cream, it would be splattered across his face like a cartoon. But he always had a clean anorak, clean jeans, so somebody prepared him in the morning. And the longest conversations I had were always kind of accidentally ignited when I would bump into Vic, who we never exchanged phone numbers, let alone arrange to meet. But when we talked, sometimes we would talk for hours. And I came to enjoy his company. He was so observant. He could spot loose change on the ground from 200 yards away. He could tell which of his old friends were in the neighborhood from studying the bottles under the bushes. And he told me, in fact, this area used to be a haven for drunks. He said even the local church organist would sit on a bench with the other drunks all afternoon, whiling away the time, get up to go and do a funeral and come back and pick up the cider bottle. He's dead now, of course. And Vic's drinking stories had a kind of epic quality that my housemates lacked. There was a time, for example, he came to on a mortuary slab. He said the nurse on duty got a real shock when he sat up. He still didn't know if it was somebody's idea of a practical joke. And one afternoon, I was just by the station and I heard this amazing raging bellow coming from underneath the underpass beneath the station. Was all tiled. So it gave a kind of echoing, vibratory kind of, really sounded like the coming of the gym that's 8Q. And I was amazed and delighted when he emerged from this tunnel, tiny compared to the noise that he'd been making, kind of looking around all vexed and sensible, like he was wondering why everyone was looking so shocked by his coming. And he smiled when he saw me, which I think might have been a first. And from then on, they used to visit me because it was a nice place. And it came to be that one of the highlights of my week was when Janet and Jim came and we'd go around the gardens. With him, the gardens were a kind of different thing because he was interested really only in the creatures, not the plants. So we'd go downstairs at the Palm House and look at the pretty but dim seahorses just floating around there. And then we'd go to the natural pond and feed a big posse of ducks and geese and moorhens. He was too young really to have gotten throwing in his arms. He'd try and throw, but the bread wouldn't go anywhere. So he had to try and copy us and just hold the morsels of bread out for the birds to snatch off with their beaks like that. And there was a kind of pure drama in watching him build up the courage to do that, because although the beaks didn't hurt when they snapped them, it was clear that the birds didn't care that the snapping of their bill didn't hurt. And he developed, he had a little spell where he had a phase where he kept wandering off and joining other families. We'd be walking around and he'd just go, "I'm just going to try and be with this family here. They've got like more kids and maybe it's more fun." And we'd have to wheel him back in. I remember there was one afternoon we were walking around. He was blessed with a cold winter sunlight. And he was sitting on my shoulders and I pointed to the shadow on the ground of us. And I said, "Look, Jim, can you see? That's us." And he looked up and he pointed up and he went, "Look at the moon." So I thought, oh, he's not listening. So I tried it again a few minutes later. I said, "Look, Jim, can you see? That's our shadow." And again, he looked up and he went, "Look at the moon." And he developed this, a little kind of game or routine. Just as we were leaving, he would stand on the edge of the ornamental pond and stare into the cold, dark waters with a kind of stillness and solemnity that you wouldn't credit for someone still coming up to their second birthday. And it's like when he did that, Janet would talk to him in a different tone of voice. It wasn't just like, "Stay off the daffodils, Jim," or "Don't go off with that family, Jim." It was like, "Jim, don't, we won't come in and save you." The agents I'd gotten in touch with before Christmas were still slowly getting back to me. And I became fascinated by the variety of means they found to turn me down. I mean, one woman phoned up and she says, I'll probably hate myself for the rest of my life for this. That's a bit much, really. And on the other hand, there were these two young guys who had been assistants to an agent who'd recently been in prison for embezzling her clients. They kind of punched me on the shoulder and said, you know, if you think about it, our past is hardly a recommendation, is it? Hey, you're probably best off without us, mate. But after events like this, and actually even worse, really, a lack of events like this, later in the day sometimes, that kind of swarm of thoughts all about me being worried about what was going to happen to me. I'd go back into the gardens, often kind of in the last hour, just as the light was beginning to fade. And whereas in the morning I had this mission to remind myself that the variety of the shapes and colors in the natural world beggar the imagination of humanity, I had a different, more corny mission, really, more stupid mission in the afternoons. And that was to try and find something that was changing. Just a reminder that spring would come. And actually, in the deep midwinter, you can still find something in Kew Gardens that's beginning to bloom. It would take quite a bit of time, but if you searched in the recesses of the Palm House and the Temperate House, always, one time I remember I found this little Mexican plant that had tiny pink sheaths dangling from it. Some days it was also difficult that I wouldn't be able to find anything new. So in that instance, I would just go back and stand by the thing that I discovered the day before and just stare at that glumly. My entertainment mostly came from working on the transcriptions. When I was home, I hardly spoke to the people I lived with. I just sat in my room, going through those transcriptions. And actually, although it had been difficult to kind of get into the story, once I had, I started to find it was really brilliant, kind of ripping yarn, as it described how in 1990, in the build-up to Desert Storm, he and all the other expatriates were all summoned to the embassy and told one night to try and get out of the country by hook or by crook, because the borders were being closed, because Saddam Hussein wanted to use Westerners as a kind of human shield. So a brilliant description of how he and this other guy come up with this plan that involves hiding out in a fishing boat and covering themselves with palms and drifting towards the border. And they're a mile or less short of the border, and the palms are ripped back, and there's the police, and they're arrested and thrown on this train, taken back to Baghdad. And then it ramps up even more as the guy's amazed and astonished and kind of alarmed when they get to Baghdad station, and it's been closed down. It's empty, except for them arriving. And he goes, this is weird. It's like we're being treated like really important, key political prisoners, and we're just a couple of engineers trying to get out of the country. And he's even more appalled when he's thrown into a taxi and taken to the secret police headquarters in Baghdad, a building from which he knows no Westerner has ever emerged still able to tell you their own name. Like, he's terrified. On March the 19th, I woke up. The electricity was gone in the house again. The place was ice cold. I don't mean March the 19th, I mean February the 19th. I'd been there about just over 3 weeks. The place was ice cold. Electricity was off, my computer was dead, I couldn't work. I went out of my room and I saw that somebody had broken the glass on a framed picture on the wall and left the shards all over the stairs. And I was like, I've got to, this is all. I need some kind of change. I can't stand this bloody place anymore. I went 2 steps at a time down the stairs, trying to avoid the glass. I went out the house and was walking around. And as soon as the gardens opened, I walked in there and I went, I need a sign, some kind of sign, some kind of encouraging sign. And it'd been very windy the night before and some of the benches had blown over. I thought, there it is, there's a sign. Even the benches can't stay off. We're all screwed. Ranting away there, I came out of the Temperate House. And off in the distance, I thought I could maybe see, maybe there was a hint of maybe a trace of purple on the grass. I mean, it's so kind of vague and small that I didn't even know whether it was real. I had to approach to find out that Yes, indeed. There was a little patch of purple flowers. There were crocuses. Now, crocuses usually grow to about 6 inches tall. These were much smaller than that. They must have been in the first hours of their life. And as I crouched and looked at them, lo and behold, I could see a few others dotted about, beginning to poke up through the grass. And over the next days, every day, there was like thousands more of these crocuses. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was almost kind of freakish. I almost felt like I could have stood outside in the street with my ear to the wall overnight and just heard them all whispering up through the turf. It was like there was a million of them or something. I mean, in fact, I learned later that 1 million crocuses were donated to Kew Gardens by the Dutch at the end of the Second World War, and it's a feature of the place. So that was that. You want a sign? Here's so many you can't even count them. And while that was happening, I went up to visit my parents up in North Wales. And their lifestyle was about as far removed from my housemates as it's possible to imagine. Now, I remember one day I was watching a long, expensive adaptation of an Agatha Christie novel on the screen, and there was a dog in it. And about halfway through, I suddenly went, you know, the dog is about as good as most of the other actors. Now, there were a few principals who were really turning in some juicy work, but on the whole, all the other actors, the dog was about as good as the two little old ladies they'd hired to play the two little old ladies, and the athletic young man they'd hired to play the athletic young man. It maybe took more takes, but, you know, it was an odd moment. It was the moment when I finally realized that actually brilliance has very little to do with earning a living as an actor. It's kind of weird, negative epiphany. And the odd thing was, the next day, I got a phone call from the casting department of a television show called The Bill that I'd already heard mentioned as, you know, needing tons and tons and tons of actors as the most likely place to ever give me a general audition. And that was what they were offering me the next day. So I cut short my visit with my parents and went down to... Now, the other interviews that I had been with agents like right in the middle of the West End. So they'd been my only trips really to the centre of London. So they at least gave me the illusion of being in the middle of things for an hour or so. But the offices of The Bill were like in this industrial wasteland beyond South Wimbledon. It was like a long walk from a wasteland to get to these offices. And I got there, and there was a couple of guys, they're nice, friendly guys, and they looked at my picture, and they said they'd photocopy it a few times and leave it strewn across a few desks. Who knows? You know, they said, you never know. With a smile that clearly said, we do. But I appreciated the gesture. And I came back, I got back that night to discover that there was a party going on in the house that I lived in. Claire was the first of the original tenants who were there when I moved in to leave. She'd finally graduated, and she was leaving the next day to go and become a nanny in the States. At first, I'd heard about that because I wasn't really in communication with them, but they were all there that evening in Claire's rooms, kind of sitting on beanbags and this, that, and the other, and watching her. And she was sprawled across the famous wicker chair from the Emmanuel poster, trying to claw the cellophane from a packet of cigarettes with insensible fingers, and holding forth in a voice that clearly intimated how certain she was that nobody would understand what she was talking about. She said, you see, when you think about a cow, you're not thinking about a cow, but a paradigm of a cow. I sat there on my quarter of a beanbag thinking, I'm sick of going unnoticed. I do understand what she's saying. I wanted to argue. I just kept silent. And by and by, they all went out for a drink to the pub. And I sat in the kitchen with Carl and Mike, who admitted that, as befitting someone who didn't drink very much at all, he was, you know, feeling a bit kind of woozy, and he was very voluble. He said, if, he said, a woman called Eva ever comes to the front door, as she certainly will at some point, don't, under any circumstances, let her in. don't. She's completely, well, given who was actually living there, I thought, how bad can she be? So I asked him, he said, well, he said, even before she came to England, when she was in Poland, she got fired by the zoo for pouring beer down the lion's throat. First time I ever met her, she lifted up her sweater to show me the claw marks. Once, I was living downstairs from her, and in the middle of the night, all this water started pouring through the ceiling. I dashed upstairs, hammered on her door, and said, Eva, there's all this water coming down into my room from yours. And she shouted, that's not water, it's white wine. Once, she actually walked through those windows there, and he pointed to a set of windows at the end of the kitchen. She walked through those windows and fell through the roof of the conservatory below. I said, Mike, there is no conservatory. That's my point. She's poisoned. Don't let her in. Carl kind of heaved a vexed sigh and trumped back to his room, and Mike sat there reminiscing about Kew and Richmond in the 1960s. He described how he'd gone to a gig one time and he saw there was a little girl who was trying to stand up on tiptoes so she could see over the lip of the stage in this band that was playing. She lifted him up. He lifted her up and put her on a stack of speakers. And then at the end of the concert, he carefully lifted her back down onto the floor. And the guitarist saw his act of kindness and came over and said hello. And this was Jimi Hendrix before his fame. Very decent, sensible young man. No idea why everyone thought he was crazy. I mean, if you think about it, he used to be a paratrooper, so he had to have a practical mind. And whatever else he did, he never poured beer down the lion's throat. You know, the more he reminisced about the 60s, and the more astonishing his stories became, the more a kind of wave of regret seemed to ooze into his tone until he ended up by saying, intense, wistful sigh, I kissed Marsha Hunt in the 1960s. And then off he went to go out and do some ballroom dancing with his Russian girlfriend. And I plodded up the stairs and went back to the manuscripts. By this point, the Welshman was in solitary confinement in the secret police headquarters in Baghdad. But no lights, no idea of the time of day, and insects crawling over him. And he sang through every song he knew and every bit of every song he knew, right down to the little bits of mental rubble. The next morning, I went to the gardens and the crocuses were all gone. They'd been away 4 days. The next time I saw Janet and Jim, they turned up with this other little boy of about Jim's age. Janet explained that he was in her care that day because his mother's ex-boyfriend was having an operation that was so serious, he'd only been given a 50-50 chance of surviving. Well, no wonder the little boy was all kind of angry and confused and rebellious. I mean, to be kind of like just out of sight of mortality, with no one able to quite explain what's going on. So, yeah, he wasn't great company, but Janet said, this boy and I understand each other. We have a connection. Jim didn't like that. We wandered around the gardens and Jim staged his own kind of rebellion. We were a glum lot. It was a sunless midwinter day. And the climax of the whole thing came when Jim, just as we were leaving, stood so close to the edge of the ornamental pond for so long that Janet was reduced to just kind of backing away very slowly, going, Jim, 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 while I kind of cruised silently up behind him in case he actually did jump. I mean, it was a proper showdown. There was a long silence. And then he whispered my name 3 times. And then suddenly broke out laughing and ran off with a wild, carefree chuckle to join his friend and Janet by the gates. As I sidled up to them, Janet turned to me and she said, have you heard about Colin? Like, it took me completely by surprise. Colin was her ex-husband. They'd broken up 15 years earlier. She never mentioned him these days. His name hadn't come up in the whole of that winter. She said, he's in hospital. His friend Chris rang to tell me. And this next remark I've never quite understood, but she said, I've got a feeling he's not going to come out. And that evening, there was another party in the places. This guy, Tim, came in to replace Claire, who'd gone, and he showed himself the proper metal for that house because he partied so hard, he didn't even make it in the long trek, 2 whole yards from the kitchen to his room. He just passed out in the hallway, and he belonged. Meanwhile, I was upstairs the whole night. For once, I wasn't in the Baghdad jail because I was thinking about Colin. I mean, I met him at the youth theatre. Janet and I had been members for a while already, and I gathered that he was her boyfriend, and there was no failing to notice him. You know, at breaks, he was kind of restless and voluble. He was always going from table to table and just making a connection with everybody, sometimes by cracking lots of jokes and then suddenly switching to a kind of a serious kind of, I'm interviewing you mode. And he smoked, I thought, as if he didn't smoke, and bounced around. Anyway, and my first real conversation with him was at a party when we got talking about music. And he left to disdain some of my treasured favorites. I was like 15 or 16 at the time. So the only evidence I had of any kind of encroaching adulthood was that I liked serious sounding bands who had themselves photographed in dim lights, you know, kind of thing. So I was wondering whether to get angry with him, and he suddenly switched and he went, I'll tell you what, he says. All this is really, it's just a matter of opinion. So just as I was taking a moment to readjust, he said, it's just that my opinions are right. And he started bouncing around on the sofa again, laughing. And then he stopped and he said, listen, I'll tell you, I know my opinions are right because I happen to be a musician. Anyway, he invited me to come to his house sometime and he would play me some music. And on a whim, I did. One evening, I just went and knocked on his front door. It's the kind of thing you could do in those days. And he was living at his mom's while he studied for Teachers Training College. She led me upstairs to his bedroom and she brought tea and biscuits and he played me some music. Remember the first record he played me was something by John Lee Hooker, recorded in Detroit just after the Second World War. I had never heard anything like it. I mean, he explained to me, he said it's been made like with just one microphone and they get an echo from sticking a microphone down the toilet and the percussion is just the guy stamping his foot. It was so kind of rough and ready and yeah, it didn't sound like a professional musician at all, but it sounded just like some guy who was just making the noise that was right for him. And Colin pointed out that it was all by standard musical standards. It was all incorrect. Like it was a 12 bar, but he kept dropping a bar. I never quite understood what they, but I could hear that the guy had never taken an exam. He'd never listened to anyone telling him how to play the instrument. He just picked the damn thing up and made the noise that he made. And I was like really, really impressed and liberated somehow by this. And he played me some other musicians that they all American blues singers from just after the Second World War, like Otis Rush and Little Walter. And all of them had this same kind of wildly individual, unschooled, untrained, mad, defiant quality that he called feel. Anyway, I found it so powerful, and he explained to me why it was so powerful. But the record he seemed to like the best of all was actually by 2 young Englishmen that had been made. It was kind of just improvised. The 2 of them composed the thing on the spot when they were very tired after an overnight recording session. It was a duet with Eric Clapton and John Mayall. It was called Bernard Jenkins. And he played this to me a couple of times and he couldn't resist picking up his own guitar and playing along with it. And he knew every little hesitation, every little bit of emphasis, punch of emphasis, and the way he knew it spoke of the hundreds of times that he'd listened to it in the past. And at the end, he said, you know, that record got me through my A-levels. And then he played me some of his own stuff. And he stopped and laughed and he said, I bet you never expected that anyone you know would be able to play this well. And he was right, I hadn't. It was stunning. We became friends after that evening. He used to take me off to rehearsals for a band he was in with a pair of brothers. And I mean, the ferocity of their commitment was almost frightening. I was 16. 2 years earlier, everything had been just playing. These guys really meant what they were doing. It was so serious. And after they finished playing, the air would bristle with opinions, you know. But by then, even new as I was to this lot, you know, I had my own ethos that I could join in the arguments with. It's all about feel. Feel, that's all that counts. Just feel. Just that rawness, that feel. Miles Davis, they go, yeah, he's got feel. Mahler, nah, too many strings. It was simple. Anyway, and then he'd drive us back from the rehearsals, and he'd wax on about the future and what was going to happen. I remember, never forget, he said one night, he said, I'm sure that no one I know will ever become famous. I don't know why he said that, but he called me up one evening, sounding very subdued. I said, what's wrong? And he told me that he'd actually been offered a job in a band, and a band that I'd heard of, like a really well-known band, one of the most successful bands in Europe at the time. I said, are you going to take the job? Well, he said, my mother's an immigrant. His father was dead, and what I understood him to mean was that he was going to continue on at Teachers Training College for a bit, maybe hand in his notice, leave in an orderly fashion so that he could come back to it if that ever happened, and do things in a proper, sensible fashion. That's what he did. He finished the year at Teachers Training College, handed in his notice, and then, and only then, he went down to London to try his fortune. He got a little tiny flat that he shared with an acquaintance he was always falling out with. He tried some auditions. He played a few times with another name band, didn't get work, and came back up to Manchester. And when he came back, it's like he responded to the disappointment of not making it by wanting to improve. From then on, he was always trying for a more sophisticated, polished style. And his new favorite word of approval was no longer feel, but now it was taste. Things had to have taste. It had to be taste all the time. And I think taste seemed to be, he liked musicians who could play really fast, but didn't. And listening to music became a real trial with him, because he was always like skipping over records. So just the tiny little moments, the little one bar or something where everything was absolutely tight and right and tasty. And he was always fiddling with the controls endlessly, adding the bass and taking away the treble and all that kind of stuff. He was just always seemed to me to be dissatisfied. He went back to playing with the brothers, but that didn't work out. They never found the missing piece. And he stopped. He went back to teaching. He married Janet, and they got themselves a flat with a, oh God, one of those, mock medieval fiberglass chess sets that nobody ever played, that Habitat used to sell. And they had a big angry cat called Lepius. Jobs, they got proper jobs. And I was kind of elbowed out. I was still stuck with trying to make it as an actor. So I lost touch with them, really, for quite a while. And so I don't really know what happened, but I think after a couple of years, they realized individually that difficult as it can seem to try and make a living in the arts, it can be impossible not to try. Janet was the first to go. She moved down to London, started working in the theatre, and he quit teaching a little bit later and went to work as a sound man in a theatre up in Manchester and opened a recording studio. And, I mean, by then, we'd grown accustomed to finding fault with each other. I look back, the 1970s were the kind of golden age of unsolicited advice. You know what you need to do? Yeah, well, you know what you need to do? Yeah, I mean, at times I was unpardonably rude to him. I pretty well lost touch with him when I moved to Canada in the early 80s. And it was only by chance that many years later, I was in England, and I realized I still had a phone number for him. I thought, I'll chance it. I'll see if he's still there. And when I did, he was as friendly and as warm as ever, and we arranged to meet. He said, though, before we met, he said, you might be shocked when you see my appearance. I wasn't. But what he was talking about was that he'd had this recording studio, it was going well, good business, but he'd contracted colitis. And it had been really serious. He'd had to take a year off work with it, go on steroids. And he described sitting in the bath, looking down at his own body, unable to recognize it, being weak. All that. He was just edging his way back to going to work. But he said, in a way it was a good thing, because I've always been a tense person, and it's an illness brought on by tension. So it's forced me to try to relax. The next time I came to town, he invited me to his recording studio. It was big. He did really well. It was a great studio. Amazing. But come in, he said, you can almost smell the creativity. And he played me some stuff that he'd recorded for some local real estate agent who made a Vanity Country and Western LP every year. And now he was in his element. He had thousands of knobs to twiddle. As he's playing this stuff, I said to him, I said, Colin, do you ever just record your own stuff? By some means other than a direct reply, he let me know that he didn't. The next time he came to town, he invited me over to his house, and I took a bottle of whiskey. And just as he smoked, as if he didn't really smoke, to me, he drank as if he didn't really drink. But we made our way steadfastly through this bottle of whiskey. And as he got more and more kind of flushed with the amber liquid kind of thing, he started playing me records that, first of all, he started off with stuff that had been made at his studio. And then when he got a little bit drunk, he'd play me some of his favorite things from the end of the 70s. And then by the end of the night, when he was kind of warm and sentimental, he went, oh God, he says, there's this one record, he says, you maybe never heard it, he says, but it got me through my A-levels. And he's rummaging around in the back of his collection. And I knew what it was that he was going to play. It was Bernard Jenkins. Yeah, anyway, Janet was so determined not to go to the funeral on her own that she offered to pay my way. But it seemed important somehow to find the money myself. Before I went, I was lucky enough, I don't know how this happened, actually, still don't know how it happened, to get another interview with another agent. And this was a woman who, she had an agency in Manchester and an agency in London. Because I'm from Manchester, but living in London, I thought we might be a good fit. I went around, I took this film that I'd made a year before and I'd been nominated for an award. I said, there's that, and we chatted, and it was so cordial. We were so in sync, I thought. It's kind of bittersweet just after hearing that Colin died, but it seemed like my problems were sorted. So yeah, I wasn't completely gloomy about my own prospects by the time Janet and I took the train up to Manchester. And then we caught the tram that used to be a train out to our home neighborhood. The road we walked along to the funeral, about half a mile walk, was the very road that she grew up on. And it all looked exactly the same, really. It was us. We were looking kind of slightly crumpled and not quite proud of ourselves. And the old gang was mooching around the churchyard and dressed mostly in kind of crumpled second-hand suits. And there was his current girlfriend and her two teenage sons whom we'd been teaching to play guitar. There was some guys were there were like legendary people from his anecdotes about his school days whom we'd never met. There was a famous person there. And there, to my surprise, was the agent I just had the interview with about 2 or 3 days earlier. I was much too tasteful to go over and introduce myself and remind her of our interview. We went into the church, and I remember the preacher delivered this eulogy that it must have been garnered from his family's memories of him. He'd say things like, there was a way, for example, Colin always used to wear black. We were all like looking at each other, going, I don't remember him wearing black. And his marriage was not mentioned. And then his best friend, Chris, got up, shaking with a combination of nerves and deep feeling. He delivered this beautiful eulogy that really did justice to Colin's amazing array of gifts and his generosity of spirit and his humor. We didn't quite skirt around this kind of restlessness and the discomfort of him either. Like he talked, for example, about how Colin would pick up Lepius, that cat, big, ugly kind of cat, and he would hold him in his palm with poor old Lepius's back spread across his palm. Lepius would hate this so much, he would stretch out across his hand with his claws out front and back and then flip himself back onto the floor and bang, land on the floor and stalk off. Some way in my mind, though, Lepius's kind of frustration seemed to be Colin's somehow. It was like Colin was trying to get Lepius to feel how he felt. And when the pallbearers turned up and started carrying the coffin out of church, I was like, you can't do that. That's my daft mate, Colin. But they couldn't. He did. And we all walked up the street. We knelt by the graveside and we had to pick up a fistful of dirt and drop it on the coffin. It landed with a clunk. I said to someone, I said, this is my first. They said, you'll get used to them. Oh, we all went to a little pub just up down the road. The last time I'd been there, it seemed to me I'd had to, argue and prove that I was old enough to drink. And here we were the next time. First of the old gang. We took the train back. And on the train back, there was just me and Janet. And out of a long silence, she said, he was an alarming man. It's like he was always fixing things until they broke. That's sort of what he did with himself in the end. But I was just sitting there thinking, how come he never recorded himself? By the time I got back home, it was dark. And the bakery was just about to close, but I saw Vic was sitting in the window of the bakery with this guy that I'd never seen him with before. He was a big guy, in his 60s, but, still good-looking fella. And Vic said, are you okay? He said, I've never seen you looking like this before. And the other guy put his hand out and he introduced himself as Bruce. And as soon as I heard him speak, I guessed he was Canadian. He says, say this. This shaking keeps me steady. Say it. This shaking keeps me steady. I should know. What falls away is always and is near. Yeah. Okay. Write this down. Get a pen, piece of paper, write it down, learn it. I wake to sleep and take my waking slow. I learn by going where I have to go. We'll meet, talk. Off he went. And I never did find out why that agent was at Colin's funeral because she rejected me by mail. Thank you very much for staying. Thank you, all of you. Cheers. I'll unmute you. No, unmute yourselves. Sorry.
Thank you, Alan.